very low levels or very high levels of dopamine are correlated with certain states of, for instance, low happiness or the absence of happiness. We could even call it depression in some cases, or extreme happiness or even euphoria, sometimes even inappropriate euphoria, as is the case with bipolar depression, or as it's sometimes called bipolar mania or bipolar disorder. Now, of course, there's a range in between depressed and manic, and most people, fortunately, reside somewhere in that range. And it is indeed a continuum. And I think it's safe to say that levels of dopamine probably do correlate with levels of happiness. But there is no one single chemical nor chemical signature that is no specific recipe of 2 parts dopamine to 1 part serotonin to 1 part acetylcholine that we can say equates to happiness. Indeed, there's now tremendous controversy as to whether or not, for instance, having lower levels of serotonin is actually the cause of depression or merely correlates with depression, or maybe doesn't even correlate with depression at all. This became especially controversial because in the last year, the so-called serotonin hypothesis of depression has been called into question. And indeed, it does seem to be the case that for individuals that are depressed, their levels of serotonin can sometimes be normal. However, and this is an important however, that does not mean that administering drugs that increase levels of serotonin in depressed people does not sometimes, and indeed often, help ameliorate some of their symptoms. I should mention that many of the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so-called SSRIs, such as Prozac and Zoloft, etc., are still considered excellent treatments for conditions like OCD and so on and so forth. But what I'm trying to do is make 2 important points. First of all, that language is not a great indicator of internal state, especially when trying to understand other people's internal state, and that is especially true for things like happiness, and that there is no one chemical signature of happiness. There's no one neuromodulator or combinations of neuromodulators that we can say is the cocktail for happiness. But, and it's a very important but, when levels of dopamine and serotonin tend to be chronically low for an individual, below their typical baseline, they will, yes, tend to be lower in affect and have lower mood and less episodes of happiness per day, per week, per month, per year, etc. Conversely, when an individual has elevations in dopamine and serotonin levels, in particular dopamine levels, and the other so-called catecholamines, which include epinephrine and norepinephrine, so the catecholamines are dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. They're all very similar biochemically. They all lead to states of elevated motivation, energy, and so on. When those chemicals are elevated above baseline, people do tend to have elevated sense of mood and well-being, and in particular, sense of possibility about what they can do in the world and what the world can offer them. So we need to acknowledge those 2 features of language and neurochemistry as we wade into the discussion about the psychology of happiness, and in particular about the controlled experiments that have been done in excellent laboratories focused on the psychology of happiness and what brings happiness and what does not. There have been some excellent studies on happiness, and these come in 2 forms generally. One form of these studies is individuals come into a laboratory, they participate in an experiment over the course of a day or months, and then data are collected, analyzed, and the papers are submitted and published and discussed. The other form is a so-called longitudinal study, where individuals come into the laboratory and they are studied over a very long period of time, ranging from months to years and sometimes even decades. And then the variables of age, life circumstances, and other factors can be incorporated into the data. And typically there are multiple papers, there's data published throughout the longitudinal study, or sometimes it's just one paper at the end of the longitudinal study. Let's talk about one of the more famous and perhaps the longest running longitudinal study on happiness. This is a study that was initiated or conceived in 1938 at Harvard University, the so-called Harvard Happiness Project. Some of you have probably heard about this. It involved Harvard College sophomores, and other individuals were incorporated into this study as well. It's a study that initially had more than a couple of hundred subjects, but because some have either dropped out and not been able to be contacted and monitored over time, or died, or for whatever reason, are no longer participating in the study. There are very few of these individuals left, and yet there's tremendous power to a study like this. It's such an impressive study, and we're all so grateful that laboratories at Harvard decided to initiate and continue this study, because it is one of the few studies, perhaps the study, that has allowed us to understand happiness in our species over a very long period of time. Like any study, it's not perfect. It didn't include a lot of matching by sex or matching by vocation or matching by income and background. And back then, there was also a lot less discussion about trauma and histories around trauma, as well as positive episodes in people's lives. Nonetheless, there's a lot of power in a study like this. And there's some very basic takeaways, some of which you may have heard before, but some of which may be surprising those of you who haven't. So one of the key things about this study is people in the study, at least those who still have intact memory, which many of them do, are able to think back on not just their previous year or week, but 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and compare what makes them happy at one age versus another age. A number of things have emerged from that conversation. So I just want to discuss some of the highlight points. Then we'll get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of the data. First of all, it's been discussed many, many times that the total amount of income that an individual makes or has, and again, this could be income from work or it could be money that they inherited, does not seem to directly relate to their level of happiness. Now, a lot of people take that point and think, money doesn't matter. Other people hear that point and think to themselves, yeah, right, easy to say if you have a lot of money. We'll talk about the interpretation of those data in just a few minutes, but I do want to earmark that finding because I agree that while money or total resources itself does not predict happiness in any kind of direct way, that is not the same thing as saying having very few resources will make you happier, of course. I don't think anyone would imagine that. But it also tends to overlook an important point, which is something that I certainly have learned to appreciate in my life, and something that I especially appreciated when I was a student and postdoc, which is the following. People will say money can't buy happiness, and we'll talk about the buy aspect of that in a moment. And indeed, that's true. If you look at this longitudinal study or you look at other studies that are done on a more short-term basis, once people get past a certain level of income relative to their cost of living, the amount of happiness does not scale with that income. That is, for every additional $1,000 or $10,000 that they earn, they don't report being that much happier on a daily basis.